Hey everybody. The Charlie Kirk Memorial service, in my view, was the most important political rally in our nation since the 2024 election. This one told us really everything we need to know, I think, about where the religious right is at right now, or more specifically, where the wealthy and powerful movers and shakers behind the religious right are hoping to take our nation in the next few years. So I've been making a few videos to talk about it, and today I'm going to answer just a very basic question that I've been asked, which is, so what was so wrong about the Charlie Kirk Memorial? And I've got just a few points I want to make. I already talked about how Donald Trump gave his most anti-gospel presentation at the end when he explicitly rejected the words of Jesus by saying, "I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them." And I made a longer video on Friday about my personal journey, about my background as a retired evangelical pastor and how 30 years ago, before I went into pastoral ministry, I actually did believe some of the same things that Charlie Kirk believed. And I think that might be the most important video that I've made in a while for anyone who wants to understand my heart on these issues. Because as you're going to see today, I just tend to be super critical of the MAGA movement, especially since it often presents itself as a Christian movement, like it did at that rally. And I just don't have the time in every video to share my concern for the actual people in the movement, but I have deep concern for them. But I'm mostly talking about how I'm strongly criticizing the leaders of the movement. And I'm trying to expose how dangerous the movement is, not just to the nation, but really to the sincere believers who fall under its spell. And the people behind the MAGA movement are now enriching and empowering themselves, and Christians helped them to get to that position. So now these people have the power to turn our country into their own personal cash machine and sort of to entrench their families into permanent positions of power as an oligarchy in the country. And that's all they've ever wanted. And if the conservative Christian movement helps them to enrich and empower themselves, then that's the vehicle that they're going to use. But if you could conceivably take over the country with like Star Trek fans, then they'd all be dropping Klingon phrases into their speeches. I mean, that's what they do. So now that millions of Christians gave them the power that they've been seeking, they're doing what the people behind Project 2025 promised all along. They're working fast to corrupt any system that might try to hold them in check, and they're getting away with it. Why? Again, because of people who call themselves Christians by and large. Christians are still the ones who threaten the political career of any elected Republican who might stand up to Trump. The leaders of the MAGA movement are using the faith of millions of believers to advance a very unchristian agenda. And so this rally, back to this rally, that was important because it showed all of that to the world. For those who have eyes to see, these people removed their masks again. In that rally, the MAGA movement told us in their own words how they view the relationship between their faith and their politics. And spoiler alert, their politics drive their faith. It's not the other way around. I've heard a phrase that I think used to be seen as sort of a truism. This phrase, politics is downstream of culture. Basically, that means that politics conforms to culture, with the culture's flowing towards the political class, and then they adapt to the culture. Politics is downstream from culture. But times have changed, I think, partly because of social media and lots of other reasons, and partly, though, because Donald Trump is just an especially adept demagogue, and he's making a lot of people wealthy and powerful by amplifying his message, by getting on his train. But when it comes to the MAGA movement, at least, I'm convinced now that culture is downstream of politics. I think more and more MAGA Christianity is shaped by politics, not the other way around. And I don't know how many people who call themselves Christians and vote for Trump actually go to church, but let's just assume that they do. Let's assume that they go and listen to a sermon once a week. And if those sermons are anything like what was said at the rally, then they're not even hearing the words of Jesus at church. But let's assume that they do go to a good church and that their pastor is trying to share Jesus with them. So that's 1 hour per week maximum. And then all day long for the rest of the week, they're listening to Donald Trump, or they're listening to his enablers amplify his message, or they're listening to Fox News or even worse news outlets than that. And Donald Trump's voice isn't just louder than Jesus' voice, it's ever present. Christians are told to meditate on the word, to contemplate the things of God, to think on those things. But the entire agenda of MAGA communicators is to get people not to contemplate, not to reflect, just to react. So they fill them up with fear and rage and a very unhealthy degree, I think, of self-righteousness. And they wash it all down with just the thinnest possible bit of gospel talk. They give their followers a few words, like just enough of a synthetic mRNA gospel to immunize them against the real thing. And honestly, after watching the speakers at that rally, I think most of them just aren't even good at pretending that they're trying to live by the actual words of Jesus. This isn't about reading between the lines when I say that. I mean, I just watched it, and they state their intentions clearly, repeatedly. They talk about how they view their faith and their politics. They make it very clear. And yeah, they use some vague American terms like freedom a lot, and dog whistles like Western civilization that were so loud that I think the German shepherds and Rottweilers across the country howled from the ringing in their ears. And the fact that millions of American Christians watched all of that and didn't recoil from it, I think that only shows how deep this deception goes. So in a nutshell, that's what was wrong about the Charlie Kirk Memorial rally. I think it was a rallying cry for a movement that's based on a false gospel. It's a movement that rejects Jesus' words about a kingdom not of this world. A movement that embraces power over the other, which is the opposite of what Jesus taught. It's a movement that congratulated itself because it was able to pull thousands of people together at a stadium. And then it called that a revival, which is just obscene because a revival is the supernatural work of the Spirit. But they did something that any demagogue could have done. Many demagogues have proven over the years that this is one of the easiest things you can do, simply using human techniques. You don't need the Holy Spirit for this. As somebody who led worship for 6 years full time and then many years after that, I had to learn the subtle difference between facilitating a congregation's worship and manipulating the congregation. And it was really unsettling to me when I started to figure out that if I did certain, for instance, when I'm playing guitar, and leading the band, certain chord changes, or if I was playing the drums that day, if I hit the drums in a certain way at a certain time, invariably people would come up to me and they would say that they felt the Spirit move. And that was really disturbing to me. And it actually had an effect on me, and it kind of turned me into a really boring worship leader who would never get hired at most mega churches. So it bothers me when I see churches use all of those lights and sounds to whip people into a frenzy. And it bothered me a lot more seeing that happen on a national stage in service to this false gospel of American nationalism. It doesn't take the Holy Spirit to draw thousands of like-minded people together over a shared sense of victimhood in a time of tragedy, but then to pump them up with hot rhetoric and a ton of lights and sounds. And almost from the start of the service, the speaker started calling it a revival to tell the people what you're experiencing right now is a revival. It's not just all, it's, the lights and sounds. I think of the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the fascists behind the curtain. You're experiencing a revival. So anyway, I'm sorry, but calling that a revival is just gross. And so I know people are going to want specific examples, and they'll want me to go deeper into what I mean when I talk about this false MAGA gospel. So I've got 4 specific videos planned coming up when I can get them done, where I'm going to go deep into 4 of the actual speeches and speakers, because I think these 4 examples tell sort of a complete story. There's a lot more I could say, and maybe I will if people are finding it helpful. But when I made the first video about Trump's words at the rally, I hadn't watched all the speeches yet. But since then, I downloaded the entire transcript of every word that was said on that stage over 5 hours. And I've watched many of these talks in addition to reading them. And honestly, it was worse than I thought. So if you're wanting clear examples of what I'm talking about, I picked 4 of the talks that I think tell the story. And I might do more, like I said, if people find it helpful. But this is where I'm going. First, I'm going to do a video on a phrase that Pastor Rob McCoy used in the service and that other people echoed. He said, you see, Charlie looked at politics as an on-ramp to Jesus. He knew if he could get all of you rowing in the streams of liberty, you'd come to its source, and that's the Lord. Now, I've got several problems with that statement, but even if I believed that that was Kirk's motivation, I'm going to talk in the next video about why politics is a terrible on-ramp to Jesus. It's possibly the worst on-ramp a person could use. One of the worst for sure, because by necessity, politics uses people's tribal prejudices to draw them in onto your team. But by definition, it can't then challenge those tribal prejudices, because then the movement would cease to exist. And Jesus was all about abolishing tribalism. The gospel annihilates tribalism. So I have a lot more to say about that, and I'll talk about it in that video. I also plan to do a video about Pete Hegseth's talk and about Hegseth himself. And I'll be working on that one with my friend Amy Hawk, who a lot of people on this channel will recognize. She's done a lot of work around Doug Wilson's Christian nationalist empire in Moscow, Idaho, and Pete Hegseth is a part of that. And it's really, this is something people need to understand. So then I'm going to make a video about Benny Johnson's talk, and that one's interesting because Benny Johnson focused his talk on the power of the government and how the government has been instituted by God, which we hear a lot of that rhetoric. I've talked about that in the past. And if you haven't seen Benny Johnson's talk, though, and what he does with that, you'll get chills when you hear him say that he wants Trump to use the power of the sword to terrify Americans, evil Americans, by which he clearly meant the left. He didn't mean, mass murderers or whatever. He's talking about the left. And then finally, I'm going to talk the 4th video about Stephen Miller's screed, which I think a lot of people did see. And in that video, I'm going to lay out all the marks of fascism that I've talked about for years. And I think we can just check the boxes off together as we listen to his speech. If we put all of those marks of fascism that I've talked about on bingo cards, we'd all go home winners after Miller's speech. So anyway, that's what's coming up. And I'm looking forward to going deeper on these things in the coming days. And I've been really appreciating the questions and the pushback that people have given me in the videos. I learned so much from that, and it helps me to know what people are thinking. So please continue commenting and continue pushing back, because that helps me to sharpen what I'm saying. I believe strongly in what I'm saying, and if I'm not saying it in a way that people understand, please let me know. So until next time, thanks for listening.